Sofia Nordvik, who is from Norway, and a youth delegate.
To everyone in Stockholm and to you. I will try to be short and precise, but I want to say what everyone knows, and that's that the world will look very different if young people were actually in charge. And if the millions of strikers were actually part of creating the policies that we follow and part of creating the national goals that we follow, we would walk a different pathway than we are today. Because young people know that it's time to act. We know that climate change is about people. We know that people are fleeing already today because of natural disasters, and we know that this will be even worse in the future. We know that we have been walking the wrong way for a very, very long time, and we have taken some very bad choices along the way. But we also know that it's still time to change this. If we really decide straight away, we can actually turn this really, really bad pathway. But if we are to change this, we depend on young solutions. Because young people are striking in the streets, not because they lack spare time activities, but because young people really have solutions that could change the world completely. And now it's up to the politicians to choose if they are to clap their hands and nod to young people, or if they want to take young people seriously. Because young people all over the world are providing solutions that the world needs, but we need to use those solutions while these people are still young. We can't wait until they get to power, because then it's too late. So my really, really big wish for both the ministers in Stockholm and for this meeting is that the politicians really see the solutions that young people bring to the table and take them seriously, because that's the only way that we can really change this. And it will demand some hard choices, but young people have really shown that we are ready to change this world completely. And then when we look in the future, we are ready to see a new world, but we demand that the older population, that our politicians start to act in our favor and start to create the future that we would want to live with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for these challenging and very important words. And they go directly to the decision makers, at least in the Nordic countries. I think that's all from Madrid for now, and I give over to Stockholm.
And I say this feels a little bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, but this is not the Eurovision Song Contest, I can tell you. I say thank you to Madrid, and we will leave you for a short while. We'll get back to you in some 12, 13 minutes when we have a dialogue event starting here in Stockholm and in Madrid. While we wait, I have some instructions only for the Stockholm audience. So we say thank you for now and allow you to do whatever you do. And I'll tell you now that at 6:30, we have, as you can see, many chairs. We have a debate starting here. But until then, you have some 12, 13 minutes.
Thank you.
Yes, Jona?
Hi, hi. Like this? Okay. Yes, my name is Jona Þórey Pétursdóttir. I'm the Student Council President of the University of Iceland, and I come to COP25 wanting the leaders that come to this conference to listen to the demands of young people and prioritize action on the climate crisis above all else, and while doing so, not treating this as a single issue, but making it the leading issue in all policy making in other fields, because this is an emergency and we need to make it treated as such by making it the leading issue in other fields. So yes, that's my message to the leaders that are coming to this event.
Yes, thank you. And Alex?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm Alex. I come from Norway, and I'm here on behalf of the Nordic Youth Council. And my message and statement go kind of into the background of all the environmental agreements, meetings, and policies that I actually made, because the reason actually they done is kind of logic. And to me, if sometimes logic behind decisions doesn't really solve or find any solutions, then probably have to change the logic. And also I got a dream, and my dream is if politicians kind of think if they would believe in what they believe, if they were the only ones who actually believed in that. Thank you.
Okay. Now let's hear the young ones in Madrid. There you are, even though we see you there. That's a bit confusing. Bindu, what are your expectations to the decision makers and to the negotiation?
Hi everyone, I'm Bindu and I work with Climate Interactive. So my message and my expectation from COP is of course to accelerate the action, but not just accelerate the action, but to prioritize the action. As I said, I have been working with this organization called Climate Interactive in developing and disseminating interactive climate models. And it is surprising, it is frustrating, it is enlightening at the same time to see what all it takes to stay well below 2 degrees. There are so many low-hanging fruits. There are so many solutions on table, but not every one of them will have the same impact as we want to the future that we are headed to. So my message to the leaders is to prioritize the actions and really figure out, unite behind the science to decide what really is high leverage point. Thank you.
And Victor?
Hi, my name is Victor Jósa. I'm from Hungary, and I'm active also in gamified education, innovative education. And I hope for resource mobilization for climate education. And I really think it is a low-hanging fruit, climate education and educating people on a wide scale. And I really expect this to be addressed in the update of new NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move over to the decision makers and the politicians that we have. And I'll start with you, Isabella. Next week, you will be participating in the negotiations yourself. How do you comment on these expectations? Will you be able to highlight these at the negotiation tables?
Well, first of all, I think it's really encouraging to be here tonight and being linked up with Madrid and using modern technology in order to having a dialogue and being transparent on the negotiations. And really thank you to the Nordic Council for this. And I hope that we will continue like this and that people will really look and follow this on the net and so on, because we need people to engage in this and we need to be transparent. And this is extremely important in order to put pressure on decision makers and politicians. And I will really certainly do my best to be as transparent as possible on these issues. And I think the major thing that we need to focus on now globally is to talk about the climate negotiations and the climate crisis. This is not about burden sharing. It's not about sacrifice. It's in fact about salvation of our entire civilization, about the planet as such and for all future generations. And I think we've really kind of stuck in that very negative way of negotiating, where you try to take as little responsibility as possible and point to other stakeholders and countries and say, well, those are emitting much more than we are, so why should we take this responsibility? This you can hear even in Sweden in our debate, and I think that is totally destructive because everyone needs to do as much as possible, and it's not a burden. It's our possibility of survival, and we need to do that. And exactly what you were saying, the solutions are already here. They're already here. Not only biofuels or electric cars, all these solutions have been around for not only 5 years, but 50 years or more. These are only technological choices that were made long time before, even before I was born, believe it or not, that there was decisions made about the combustion engine being the choice for the car industry and going for coal instead of renewable energy for electricity. These were choices that were made. It's not technologically the destiny of humankind. These were choices that were made based on economic priorities or economic gains, if you will. So I think we need to make that very clear to everyone. It's possible to do the transition to zero emissions, and that it's not going to be something that we're going to suffer from, not even in our daily lives. I know today it's a lot of debate on why should, let's call it ordinary people suffer and not be able to take the car if you live a long way from your workplace or your school and you're dependent on cars that are now driven by petrol. I don't think that people should blame themselves about that. It's in fact the car industry, the oil industry that made those decisions for them a long time ago. So back in the 1990s, General Motors had an electric car that they never put out on the market. They redrew it. And why did they do that? So oil and the fossil industry have a lot of economic interest in us keeping this dependency on petrol, oil, and fossil fuels. And we need to get out of that, and that would be such a much more safe world, better world, a healthier world. And I think we need to get that message across.
And the next one is Sigurd Ringi. Politicians all over the world have been accused by young people, activists and others of speaking but not acting accordingly, especially when it comes to climate issues. As Minister of Nordic Cooperation, would you, for example, put the prohibition of fossil fuels on the agenda in our region?
Well, I think every government in the Nordic have set some bans on import of fossil fuel cars. Depends on 25, 2030, 2035 or so, and so on. And when it was started to discuss in that way, many said, well, that's impossible. But now we see already that it is possible. And I think the discussion, which we can also say that we can be happy about the young people have taken this big pressure on us, the politicians, older people, society, that I think we have understand it's a matter of urgency, and I think the industry as well has done a lot just in few years. So we can see innovation, we can see investment, that all of those things that we said just a few years ago, 5, even 3, were not possible in that time. I think we can say that it will already been done before we have set those goals so far away. So I'm optimist.
Yes, okay. And then we have our last speaker, Mario Numelin. You're with us from Madrid, and now you have a microphone also. You are an experienced climate negotiator. What do you think about the expectations that you hear here from our young guests? Do you think that they are realistic?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to say that our Environment and Climate Minister, Krista Mikkonen, was actually supposed to be taking part of this discussion in Stockholm today. And I know that this topic is very important for her, so she's very unhappy for not being able to participate. But for me, this is actually a very nice opportunity to be among you guys, because I think that these kinds of events are where I feel very energized and very hopeful, because I think that that it's really the young people who now bring the right messages to our negotiating tables. And if I maybe start very quickly by saying that in Finland we've had elections this year, and I think that the whole election debate was very much focused on climate and on the urgency of action on climate, and I think that's partly because of the youth demonstrations and also, of course, the civil society at large. But I think that that's exactly the right way to bring it into the knowledge of the politicians, and the right way to do it is, of course, by voting. And now we have a government which is very ambitious on climate change. But of course, I mean, we continuously need the support and the voices of the youth kind of supporting the decisions that we have to make. But then I think you asked me more about expectations of this meeting here in Madrid, and how I can see your sort of messages and what you're hoping to get out of this meeting. Maybe it's the first day today. We've had a couple of days of pre-meetings before this, and I would say that this is an important COP in many ways. I mean, the Chilean presidency calls it a COP of ambition, which means that we really have some important messages coming from the science, both last year and of course this year again, that what we are doing is clearly not enough and we have to do more. We have to increase our ambition, all of us together globally. And I think that the Nordic countries, of course, have a major role there as global leaders in climate change. And we, of course, all have ambitious policies at home. Then also I wanted to say that Finland currently holds the presidency of the European Union, which is one of the main regional groups here. And for us, as Finland, as the EU presidency, climate change has been one of our top priorities. So we want to be there to push for the EU to do as much as it can. And hopefully, I mean, that work has been successful. And the EU is currently looking at, for example, its 2050 long-term strategy and how to become climate neutral by 2050. And then, of course, there are some important negotiating issues here, like we are talking about the market mechanisms and how to get environmental integrity ensured by all these kind of international transactions of units that we're going to use. But in any case, I would maybe kind of, stress the two things, that science tells us that we have to do more, and I think that all your messages kind of push to that direction as well. And it's very useful to hear them over and over again, I think.
Okay, so actually what I'm hearing here now, both from Mario here, who is not a minister, but who will be negotiating for you and for us all, but also from the ministers, is quite good things, I think, and also hopeful signs, don't you think so? I would say that they are more optimistic than you. Am I wrong? Who wants to start? It should be working. Take the other one then.
And it's on now.
Yes.
So yeah, it's very optimistic, and I'm happy about it. We've been optimistic about this for about 40 years, so that's nice. It continues. I want to say a few things first. When it comes to, for example, you mentioned the companies and the cars and all that. It's true. It's the companies are at fault to some extent. Of course, there's the power by legislation that you can implement to combat some of the negative effects, as we've seen in Norway, for example. There's also the conversation about being positive for the future and being back up by the youth and all that. It's interesting to me that we see now that the scene has changed. We are all very motivated by the effect. We're talking about how the EU just announced this climate, emergency, state of emergency,
yes.
which is also something that should give me, at least me as a climate freak, give me some hope. But alas, I've heard those words before, and it leads to nothing apart from being re-elected. So I'm a bit cautious about the whole thing, and I'm also asking politely that maybe we shouldn't aim as much as having all these nice things to reach by 2050. That's my quick maths say that's in 31 years. That's a long time, 31 years. I want to hear, what is the plan for 2020? What's the plan for 2021? What about the new election? What about Ursula von der Leyen? Are we going to support her? What's the plan for 2030? There's many things we can discuss, but it's all about, well, by 2050 we're going to do this, we'll do this, and we had all these ambitions. Well, we've had those for 30 years, and it's not good enough. So, I mean, I want more positivity, but I want action. Yeah, thank you.
I'll take one more comment here and then I'll give it to you. Yes, please.
Yes, talking about optimism, we talked about in the beginning tokenism, and we've been talking about involving young people. And in Iceland, we've been trying to be vocal and trying to talk to ministers repeatedly on what we want to see. And we have wanted to see an emergency declaration with an action plan. And our Prime Minister actually referred to the climate crisis as an emergency in New York. But when confronted in a meeting a few weeks later on actually making it official for Iceland, that is the stance of Iceland, there was no such will. So words don't always follow with action or any official data or statements. So yeah, I'm cautious as well with the optimism, but it's better to have the debate on that ground rather than people being negative about it. So I'm definitely there. But also with the optimism of political speakers, there is the topic of experts saying that we are not reducing emission, that we have reached 1.1 degree Celsius in global warming. We are 0.4 degrees on failing the Paris Agreement. So there are big challenges ahead, and the optimism only gets us so far. Their action has to be taken.
So now Sigurður Ringi and then Isabella
Just
Lövin.
a few remarks. Firstly, I think if we look just 5 or at least 10 years back, then we would not have this discussion at all. And I think that's very positive that we are now taking both discussion with young people and all others, stakeholders in this area. I think that's very important because no government can do it by themselves or company. You have to do it all the society, the public and companies and government and local authorities and everybody as well. We took this discussion up with the declaration of emergency, and the prime ministers of the Nordic countries did that as well, and they came to that conclusion that they would do more than words. They would do it in action, and one of the things we are doing is this Vision 2030, which you can measure some goals on the way to 2030. And if we take the situation, for instance, in Iceland, of course we are very lucky to be there. We have all house warming in Iceland, all energy from 1930 and 1970 by geothermal heat. 90% of all houses are heated up with renewable energy, hot water, and the rest 10 with renewable electricity from geothermal as well. So our biggest challenge now is the transport system and the fishery. Actually, in the fishery, they have already decreased their emission by 46% now, and they will do more. And in the transport system, we are moving very, very rapidly into electricity cars. And I would say we will use electricity on cars produced by renewable electricity. it's not a genuine energy shift if you change the cars with electricity from coals. That's not a good thing. So we are, I think, on a very good way. So we say we can do it, not with words, not with declaration, but with actions. And that's our meaning that, therefore, I am very optimistic that we can do it. And then I say also, we in the Nordic country, we have to be the leaders because not all countries in the world can do it in so fast way as we can, but we can. And that's why I'm optimistic.
Isabella, you wanted to comment as well?
Yes, well, please let me correct myself if I say, if you think I'm an optimist, I'm an optimist when it comes to the technological solutions. They are already there. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic when it comes to the political will to implement the technical solutions that are already there. We should have done this. Let's say, if we had had the Paris Agreement in 2005 instead of 2015, we could have decreased emissions by 2% a year, and we would have stayed within 1.5 degrees. Now we need to decrease emissions by some 7 to 10% a year if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees. So we really put ourselves in this situation. And when I say we, you asked the very complicated question if I would have believed this, if I would have been the only one believing this or whatever. The answer to that is yes. I got into politics because of my fear of what we're doing to this planet. I was born in 1963. When I was young, no one was talking about climate change. We were talking at maximum about waste and why there's so much waste thrown, unsustainably, not being recycled and so on. But I could feel real anxiety already back in the 1980s when I saw the consumption of, useless things that we just use one time and then throw away, and this is not a sustainable society when we know we have an increasing population on this planet and they all have the right to have a sustainable lifestyle and right to food and sanitation and all of that, education. And we haven't the society as a whole has not been paying attention to this all this time. And it's very late on Earth. It's 5 minutes to midnight. We need to act very, very fast. We have the solutions. I'm quite sure of that. Iceland could even beat Sweden in our goal to be the world's first fossil-free society because you have excellent conditions to do that. So when it comes to the maritime transport sector, one of the major companies in Sweden a couple of days ago said, well, we're going for wind power, believe it or not, now for the long distance transport, which we had, I think, a few centuries ago already. So it's not new technology, but you can use it in a new way and reduce the fuel that you need. So, I mean, we should have really strong measures already by 2020 if we want to be, let's say, on the safe side. And I think we can do a lot more. But I just want you young people to also understand, I think my colleague from Finland was saying that, it's not politicians. It's different politicians that make the decisions. So the elections are really crucial here. So if you vote for politicians or for political parties that don't take climate change seriously or just point to other countries or someone else to do the job, then you're not going to see any change in your country and you're not going to see any leadership at a global level of your country. So this is extremely important, and therefore I'm really happy that we have now Greens in government in Finland. We also have a strong Green support in Denmark, and we have a strong, I would say, Green Nordic voice at a Nordic level. And we should take this opportunity to showcase that we can do this transition. We benefit from it. We can have a welfare society and do this transition.
Let me continue from there, because many of those who protest now are actually not old enough to vote, which is a democracy problem, as I can see it. We have lots and lots of children or young people below 18 who are extremely worried. So I'm going to ask you, the young ones here, in what way would you like to be involved in the discussions? How could we involve also those who are not able to do as Isabella said and vote wisely? Who would, if you start there, over there, Amanda?
Yes, of course. I mean, I often feel like there is a, I don't know, action gap or what to call it. Like I never have a platform. I'm never invited or never asked by politicians, like, what do you need or what do your company need to be successful in this matter? Because then I will tell you that you need to put higher demands on my industry. And that's like the only way forward. But then I think there is so many ways to gain agency, even though you're not old enough to vote. I mean, look at Greta, for example. She wasn't old enough to vote, but started this amazing environmental movement. I think it's only your imagination that sets the boundaries. Like, you can do whatever, just as long as you do it for not like fighting climate change, of course.
You can do whatever, but then you need somebody who helps you get those wishes come true, I think.
Yeah.
Alex.
Yeah, thank you. All right, am I on? All right, so start with the quote that goes like that. There is no prosperity without security. And this security applies for the Nordics as well. Not just in terms that the same CO2 concentration be noticed just 11 million years ago. And not just, kind of stating the facts that, children, they just skipping school and going for strikes. Something is going wrong there. I mean, like, that's explicitly indicates that society is somehow against even those quite moderate and thoughtful political decisions that are already done. And on the top of that, I would just say that, like what's happening in Madrid is like a global gathering of the most prominent politicians, businesses, and authorities, stakeholders as well, which means if not there can barely be place where like those kind of decisions might be made. And also, I think, when we just like kind of turn into that prospect of including youth, it's not only about voting and democracy, it's also how politicians actually invest in the youth, which is not only about money and kind of some financial issues, but also like how they invest trust in the youth. Because youth just like claimed a long time ago, there are solutions for all the Nordics unsustainable issues. Let's say back in Norway, we're developing electrical airplanes, which means like aircrafts will be like purely electrified soon. And also we got electrical boats. But those kind of things, they need investments, priorities, and kind of putting values on them, which is not possible without straight input from the politicians. Thank you.
Now we have Madrid. Please, Mats, could you help me out a little
I
bit?
just give the microphone to Victor, who has something to say.
Yes, thanks. And actually, I'd like to react to this last comment made about engaging people more broadly in a citizen democracy. And here I mean engaging and educating citizens on a wider scale than just climate change, so that people feel engaged in caring and taking responsibility for social issues like climate change, and to make citizenship broader than just paying your taxes, abiding the laws, but also standing up for issues which address everyone and impact everyone, like climate change. And when it comes to optimism, what makes me optimistic is to see the tendency of young people engaging through going on the streets, striking. And you really see, when you look at the tendency and the number of people from below 1 million together globally in the previous years to this year, which is basically like a hockey stick graph to several million people engaging. When do you see a hockey stick in your climate feed? Only when you look at the ppm in the atmosphere. That's the only hockey stick you see there. And I believe that these young people don't just go out there and care about it because they care about climate and ecosystems. They care about society, and they care about the society that they want to live in. So active citizenship.
I'd like to stay in Madrid for just a while and ask Mario, because you have been there today in the first day of negotiations, and I'd like to ask about the tendency that you just mentioned here in your comment, Victor. Could you sense, Mario, the tendency that you can sense among young people, but could you sense it also among the not that young people that are in Madrid to negotiate?
I think I can, and maybe one thing that I think is also maybe coming back to this question of optimism. I've also been involved quite a long time in climate negotiations, and one thing which is very clear to me now is that where maybe 10, 15 years ago it was mainly seen as an environment thing, environment ministries thing, environment ministers thing. Now it's very broadly seen as something both for the kind of top political leaders. I mean, we had here today a leaders summit. It wasn't necessarily a huge one since, as you all know, I mean, the COP was transferred here to Madrid in only 6 weeks, but still there were quite a lot of kind of major leaders from all over the world. And then also a lot of other kind of ministerial level events are organized here this week. Finance ministers, very crucial, I think, transport ministers, agriculture ministers. And of course, this also applies back home. I mean, some time ago, it was still only kind of environment ministers more or less fighting with other ministries to get some climate policies or environment policies through. But now we're really looking at these things together. And I think that's a huge change from let's say, 10, 15 years ago. And okay, things are not necessarily moving as fast as you would like to. But at least, I mean, it's a big thing, I think. And then what we've seen here today, I think that, as I said in my first intervention as well, at least I heard a lot about science, first of all, and I think that's a good sign that leaders and also participants here talk about science, because that's really what kind of puts us in a certain frame. Science tells us what we have to do. And then also, I think that very many leaders stressed the importance of the voices of the youth. I think it's been heard really around the world, and that kind of gives them a mandate. Then, of course, I mean, things are not easy. I'm not going to say that negotiations in these climate COPs, they're never easy. And like somebody was already saying, that we have to do it together. I mean, we have to have more or less everybody on board, and especially all the major emitters on board. And these things are not very easy. But then maybe one other thing which I wanted to stress is also the fact that governments, of course, have a major role here. But then it's also about the other non-state parties and not parties, but partners. And I think that, for example, the fact that we have more than 20,000 people here, we have a lot of businesses, we have the financial sector kind of very visibly here showing what they are doing. That's also something which I find very promising, that also kind of these actors have taken this so seriously. They want to be present here with us and share their experiences. So.
Actually, I'd like to ask you now, both you who are young and you who are not that young any longer, how, in just very concretely, in what way could these young people be involved in the decision making when it comes to these questions? Because it's very nice and very good that you hear them, and you now, which was not happening 10 or 20 years ago, I think you all agree on that this would not have happened 10 years ago. not even 5 years ago, I think. So this is good. But how could you be for real included in the discussions? Because I think that's the big question now. How can you be heard, and how can we see some action also from what you say? Carolina.
Thank you. I think it's very problematic then that when we talk about young people, we talk about young people as one united group. As you can see from us in this panel, we have a very different background and also maybe very different wishes. I would like to stress out that there are many ways of involving young people. I would hope that, for example, there would be increased funding for education, but also for youth organizations, which is a very concrete way of involving young people. The Nordic countries have been very good at involving youth delegates at climate negotiations. I hope that other countries would follow this example and have the youth delegates as an actual part of the delegation and not only as a token. So that's something I would hope that others would follow with. Then to jump to something completely else, we are here to talk about the COP meeting, but I think we haven't talked that much about the actual topic of the meeting, which will be the emissions and how we will trade with emissions in the future. And I hope that this will be a topic that also will be raised during this discussion.
Okay, we will have to be very fast in order to reach to that, because it's very important. So I have 3 comments here now. Joona first.
Yes, yeah. I'll be very short. Just on the involvement of children and their voices being heard, I think there's no question that action is vital. And actually, actions generally do speak louder than words. But there are many people who I don't think are hearing. And that may be the topic, and we're not speaking quite loud enough, and especially for the children to hear that they're actually being listened to.
That's actually a very important point. Sigurður Ingi.
Yes, we were talking a little bit about democracy earlier, and it's a social thing. Climate change have effect everywhere and on every human being on the earth. And then we have also, and I think we are all happy about that we have these NGOs, we have young people working together in their own NGOs companies. But I will state that it's vital that young people will also actively participate in political movements in the parties. And now I'm a chairman for my party, and I will say to you all young people, we are all waiting for you. We want to have you. Please come. We are all listening.
Jonas.
Sorry. Well, first on the how we can make young people be more active in the decision-making process. Very easy. Make a youth council in your parliament. That's it. That is it. We've been talking about that in Denmark for the past year. Nothing has happened. Make that up what you will. We can actually have a delegation or youth party being equally in power because it's all a democratic process in the parliament. It's actually not more difficult than that. It can be a council or it can be an independent party. When it comes to...
But not all youth are... I mean, Carolina was just saying, and that's, I think, an important issue as well. You agree on some things, but not on all things.
No, but if it's a part of parties, then it's part of parties and opinions. If it's a counseling, then there can be an application process. There's ways to do it. When it comes to implementing youth, also, it's about investing in goodwill, as Alex said, about investing in the future. There's only 3 things. It used to be 2 things that can piss off a Dane. One is the prices of beer go up. The second thing is losing to Sweden at football. Now is also that the politicians are not keeping their promises on the green environment politics. You can see that in the faces of the youth for Fridays for Future, they get more and more angry each time they have to go back and say the same thing, with the silence of the parliament echoing through Copenhagen. And I hope that our Minister of Environmental Policies will come next time he gets an invitation as well. Yeah, that's it.
Isabella.
Yes, I think, as you mentioned, Sweden has, for a very long time, always included a youth delegate to the negotiations, and not only climate negotiations, but basically always. And I think that's very important. But I also think there was a very important point made by Victor in Madrid about the active citizenship. And I think the young generation really, I mean, what's bringing me hope is the kind of awakening of a young generation that you need to get involved in shaping the future. And it's not going to happen automatically. And I think maybe a few generations before you were all just kind of snoozing and thinking that you go vote every 4 years and everything is automatically getting a little better each 4 years, and you're going to expect your future to be safe and everything is going to be all right. And then we wake up like in 2015 and discover, okay, it's not happening. We're actually approaching a tipping point where we might even lose control of the whole climate of this planet. And we need people to engage. But I also think the safest and most efficient way of doing that change is getting engaged in the democratic system. And therefore, I totally was nodding when you were saying, come on, welcome into our party, and welcome into our party as well, by the way.
This is turning to something.
Yes, I think we need the voices of young people who are concerned about their future, about their children's future, because we're really risking, we're jeopardizing everyone's and every generation's future now if we're not cutting emissions, basically. It's not more complicated than that. But we also know that we have strong economic forces that are trying to slow down this transition. And last year I was leading the negotiations together with the minister from Costa Rica on a small paragraph in the resolution that was going to welcome the IPCC's 1.5 degree report. And we were struggling for 1 week with certain countries, I'm not going to mention who, but who didn't want to welcome this scientific report. They didn't want it included in the resolution. The report by all the scientists in the world saying that we are risking so many things if we're not going to stay below 1.5. So in the end, we managed to get a compromise where we were welcoming the work of the scientists, not the report, you see. So, and this is happening 2018. So people, countries, companies, forces are trying to have some, let us have some doubts about science still on the climate crisis. This is what's happening. And if we're going to change that, we need strong, progressive, democratic forces to have the voice of the European Union, of other countries in the climate negotiations. If not, we're seeing what's happening with the United States. I mean, and Brazil, we don't know where they're going now, but hopefully they will stay in the Paris Agreement. But it's not going to be easy. But I think the best and safest way for us to get out of this is, one, the democratic way forward, and two, to encourage all the businesses like you're representing that have the technological solutions. They are there, and there's a lot of people and companies that can actually gain and earn a lot of money if we're going to the sustainable way. So we can actually hook up with all those, and there's a lot of those also in the United States.
So now let's turn to these emission reductions that Carolina was mentioning. And this is, of course, the goal of it, reducing emissions. But the big question is how? So I'd like now to challenge you all. So prepare a little bit, because we have very little time left. And I'd like to hear from you what our next concrete step should be if we want to reduce emissions, and as fast as possible, of course. And now I will start in Madrid. I think that we have heard many of you speak, but Bindu, you have not had the opportunity to say too much yet, so I'm asking you first. Our next concrete step, if and when we want to reduce emissions.
Yeah, so I come from Nepal, one of the least developed countries in the global south. We were talking about active citizenship, we were talking about technology and the democratic process, and this all makes me think of my home country, where many people don't even have the basic rights. And I'm in the Nordic Pavilion here talking to ministers from the Nordic countries, and this makes me think we are in the race where no one can be left behind. My question, my request, and my message to the ministers, young fellows over there and over here is, let us also think of exchanging the capabilities, exchanging the technologies, exchanging the knowledge we have, so that everyone is equally represented. Because when one is left behind, we can't succeed. We won't get there. That is not possible. That is not the future that we want. So this is my message, and this is also my request, to think in the direction where we are trying to hit it to like well below 2 degrees, but we need everyone. And we can't leave people who are least privileged and people who are most vulnerable to be left behind in the process. Thank you.
Okay, Victor, you're next.
When it comes to cutting emission, please let's put a price on carbon worldwide. A carbon price. Let's start with a lower one that everyone agrees with. I don't know, $50 per ton of carbon more. Let's have a carbon price. That's gonna make polluters pay and emit less.
Mario.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to say that personally, I very much agree to what Victor has said. I think it's really crucial that we get a price on carbon, but that's not maybe an immediate solution. We all know how difficult that is. But then maybe more from this civil servant perspective, what I think is now very important is next year we have 2 important deadlines for all the parties to the Paris Agreement, and that is the update of the NDCs, so mainly the emission reduction commitments, and then also the delivery of the long-term strategies. And I think that it's very important that, first of all, of course, we all do what we have to do, that we do our own homework and we come up with ambitious NDCs and long-term strategies in line with the Paris Agreement and its goals, and then that we also work together with all the other, especially major emitters, to make sure that we do this globally.
Alex, you're the next one here.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for giving me a word again. I would just say that, you know, if you take the historical retrospective and just look how the thing's been developing, there is no better solution, as experience shows, than just like put penalties and subsidizing things that more environment than others. Well, it's hard to be super radical and just like, you know, put forward kind of claims that no like fossil fuels or like benzene or diesel cars, because it's even like hard to achieve back in Norway. But I think more progressive approach and just like creating those penalties and charges will make sufficient result in the long term.
Okay, thank you. Jonna?
Yes, I'd like to actually suggest something that the Climate Strike Group in Iceland suggested, that carbon footprints should be evaluated for all actions of Congress and Parliament, bills, parliamentary resolutions, and etc., to increase transparency and assess which actions work best in line with the 1.5 degree Celsius target that the Paris Agreement works towards.
Okay, thank you. Jonas?
Yeah, I'll just echo Jonna and Victor. So that thanks for making my job easy. Of course, the carbon footprint is difficult to measure, but it's just something we have to work towards implementing. First of all, we need to figure out how can we not just simply move our emissions to another country where they produce our new goods, so also track it so there. It's easy for us to say, well, now on we only buy shoes made from good quality leather and ecological, organic, grown, whatever, leather and stuff like that. But it's made by a factory in southern Taiwan. It crosses 5 different container ships before going to Europe and then being flown from Italy to Denmark. It's not really the best way to go forward by being emission-free, right? So tracking it from the source to the consumer's hands is difficult, but gotta start working on it. Thank you.
Carolina.
I'm gonna say like Greta Thunberg, listen to the science. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the best way is to cut carbon emissions. I just don't. But I'm very curious to hear what the ministers think about this subject.
But first, let's hear Amanda.
Yes. No, but I think a lot about taxing pollution instead of the people. And I would love to see from my industry, or like demands on my industry from the politicians, that we can have maybe a construction project where we measure pollution or carbon instead of having the project centering about money, because that's usually, it gets very expensive to build cheap in the end. And if we can center it around maybe carbon and environmental friendly building instead, that's a long-term building.
Isabella.
Okay. Usually when I get that question, I say, I can't answer. There's not one silver bullet, because we need to transform the whole of society, and we need to address agriculture, we need to address the transport sector, and we need to address the industry sector, and of course housing. Basically, that's that. And then we need to address the issue of equity and supporting developing countries. And we need to have policies in place for all of that. And in Sweden, we adopted a climate law. We now have the Fossil-Free Sweden roadmaps on 13 sectors, and housing is one of them. And we're trying to identify the right legislation that it needs to be put in place, and the right types of subsidies we need to put in place, and so on. And
but you can't do all of these things at the same time.
To have a serious transition to a net zero emissions society, you need to do your whole homework. But of course, it would be a lot simpler if we had a global price on carbon. However, I think that would be extremely difficult to get in time for, the urgency we have. So we have to trust in leadership in some countries that can show that this transition is possible, and hopefully we can export these solutions and others will follow. And of course, we should support developing countries in this transition.
Sigurd Ringi.
Yeah, I think most of the things have been mentioned. It's not one answer to that question. We in the Nordic countries, democratic countries, we have a good history to be good leaders in good politics, and build up a great sustainable societies in all Nordic countries. Now we have come together with this vision 2030, we are working on to be sustainable in 2030, and climate issues is number one, number two, number three. So we will do a lot of things together in cooperation with countries, between companies, by the general public, but also so we can show the leadership. But we also have to do as Isabella said, and we have to look around in the world, and everybody have to do their part. We have to look to ourselves, and then we have to cooperate with all others. Then we can make it. So I will end this with still being optimist.
Okay.
And we are listening.
That's good, and that's the most important thing, that you all listen to each other. Also, I mean, it has to go both ways, of course. And now actually our time is finished, but I am going to, no, not care about that. I'll take another 5-10 minutes here, because we want to take some questions from the audience here. And I have seen 2 hands, and depending on what you ask and the answers. Yeah. Yes, first you, and then you on the back row, and then let's see.
Hi, great. My name is Aaron Taki. I'm a research assistant at the Climate Change Leadership Node at Uppsala University. We work a lot with carbon budgets and looking at Sweden's mitigation pathways. And I welcome a lot of the positive sentiments that we have here. But I think it's also important to realize that saying that Sweden's emissions have reduced since 1990 is also a bit of a misleading statement, because it excludes flying and it excludes import-based emissions. If you include those, there's not really been any change. So I think firstly, we need to start looking at the science and talking honestly. But then my question is more related to the economic aspect. If we continue to grow at 3% per year, the economy will be 2.5 times larger by 2050. As it is, we're already facing a huge challenge of decarbonizing our economy at its current size. Yet we still use GDP growth as our main metric of well-being and progress. So my challenge and my question to the ministers and anyone else, in this public discourse is, when will we move beyond GDP as a metric? If the Nordic is a leader in the world, why can't the Nordic be a leader in measuring what we consider to be progress? Because it's pretty hard to reach your goal when you're measuring the wrong thing, in my honest opinion. Thank you.
So who wants to answer this?
Just 2 remarks. I think all the Nordic countries are using social index progress and some other measurements, not only the GDP. So I will believe in not so many years that they will have equal rights, can we say, as the GDP to measure progress in our societies.
So thank you for the question, and thank you for also the opportunity to say that we actually have introduced alternative ways of tracking and measuring well-being in the state budget ever since 2015, I think. And it's 15 different indicators that we now follow. So GDP, of course, is not one single, let's say, the factor of well-being, and we can see that, for instance, health issues related to psychological non-health in Sweden is increasing a lot, which is really a sign that we're not moving in the right direction. Also, thank you for pointing out our imports that is not measured in the Swedish way of, or not in any country's way of measuring its national emissions. And of course, we are we're putting our emissions in someone else's budget in that way, and we should take responsibility for that. And we have also agreed that we should start with a strategy of reducing Sweden's emissions abroad, let's say.
Okay, thank you. If nobody else wants to answer, then we have a question in the back first. Okay. And then we have a, yes, I can see you now, you're waving, yes.
I'm involved in an environmental organization.
Please present yourself.
Yes, my name is Mariam, and I'm involved in Extinction Rebellion. And I think, like all the environmental organizations, strongly believe in democracy. I haven't heard of any that doesn't believe in democracy. But as we see now, the way we have set up democracy, we have failed to solve this problem that we know for a really long time. So do you see any improvements that can be done to make our countries more democratic? And also, I think it's something wrong, like if children that go to school learn about the climate issues, but the older generation, they learn about the climate issues through media and through what the politicians saying. And you're saying that you're optimistic about the future. I haven't heard any scientists saying they're optimistic. And there's a big dissonance there. And I think you have to address it, because like a democracy can't just decide not to listen to all those people and young people that go on demonstrations. You have to take that in, even though they can't vote, and you have to represent them as well. And they have listened to the scientists, and they're not optimistic. They're even doubting if children can really expect. They know they can't have a better future, but can they have a future? You have to address that, because that's what we're worried about.
Thank you. And now very fast, because we need to give the word to Madrid before we finish. Who wants to answer? This was a challenge to democracy, actually, that we heard here.
Yes. Well, I don't know of any other system that can work more efficiently than democracy. And even if we're facing a huge challenge now, I think the Swedish Greens, we came into government in 2014. We had 6% of the votes by then. The election in 2018, we barely made the threshold of 4% of even getting into the Swedish parliament. So basically, your plea and your passion and your warnings, those should be, you know, to also all the voters. Who are you voting for? Because, you know, we see this as our main priority, and we see that other parties don't. And actually, the biggest party not in government now, in their shadow budget, they want to decrease the price of carbon. They want to make it cheaper to you know, use petrol and diesel in your cars in 2019. I find that unbelievable. But no, my answer to you, I don't have an answer how we could perfect democracy. But we have already a parliament, and that is the reflection of the Swedish voters.
Alex, I know that you want to say something, but I'm going to give Madrid the last question here now, because we need to finish in 2 minutes. Madrid, please.
Yes, and we have a young man in a white T-shirt who will take the last question.
Thank you. My name is Lubomir, and I'm a climate activist. Thank you very much for this discussion. It was very interesting, and it's great that this dialogue exists.
Oh, we would like to see
But
you.
I would like to ask you, we have heard a lot about like listening to the scientists, about the IPCC report. Would you say that based on this information we have, that nuclear power is actually a part of the low carbon solution for the future? Thank you.
That was a very clear question. Would you say that nuclear power is a part of the answer? Jonas wants to answer.
I'll try to. I don't see that question as being necessarily relevant at this point. If we speak at the Nordic perspective, we just heard about how they solve energy in Iceland. We know how we solve energy, or we try to solve energy in Denmark, and how they try to do it in Norway, and Sweden, and Finland. So the nuclear power is, I think, is more about an economic value, because most people don't want to look outside the window and see a windmill. So honestly, yes, it's very doable. It's very clean. There's the risk, obviously, as we all know. And I don't think it's worth taking when we can make the energy as cheap as we can by building the facilities that we can already make use of as quickly and as efficient as we are already doing. Thank you.
And that was the answer. No, Isabella?
No, I agree. I mean, we have an agreement in Sweden, cross-party, that we should have 100% renewable electricity by 2040. And this has unleashed an enormous willingness to invest in renewable energy in Sweden. And in fact, we're not going, but the industry itself is going to shut down 2 reactors, Ringhals nuclear plant in the end of this year. and the energy or the electricity of that plant is already going to be replaced by wind energy by 2023, and even more so, and we're still exporting. So I think the nuclear is not going to be competitive to the low prices of new renewable energy, and in particular wind energy.
So unfortunately, now we are 10 minutes over what we had at our disposal. So I will say to all of you, and I'm going to repeat the names here of these stars that we have with us here today: Amanda Borneke, Carolina Long, Jonas Färjeman, Jona Thorei Petursdottir, Alex Seagal, Victor Josa, Bindu Bandari, Isabella Lövin, Sigurdur Ingi Johansson, and Mario Nummelin. Thank you very much for being here. I know that there are many more questions, both in Madrid and here, but maybe you'll stay for just a while so that you that have questions can get the answers afterwards. Thank you very much. The next event here will start at 8 o'clock. Thank you. Debate, and we have two guests on the screen and 4 here, and we have a new moderator for you. This is Paul Bowman. You are from the Institute of Future Studies, and now this stage is all yours.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to introduce our panelists tonight. So first in Madrid, we have Richard Jones from Oxford University in the Met Office. So can you say hello, Richard?
Hello.
There's Richard.
Hi.
Second, we have Emmanuel Raju from Copenhagen University, also on the screen. Third, we have Emily Boyd from Lund University for the Center of Sustainability Studies.
Hi.
Next, we have Sophie Axelsson from Fridays for Future.
Hi.
Fridays for Future.
Fifth, we have Guy Finkill from Push Sweden. Hello.
Hey.
And finally, we have Jonas Figerman from Regeneration 2030. Thank you. Okay, so this event is on what's come to be known as Attribution Science. So I'm going to start with Richard. I'd like you to begin by explaining what Attribution Science is. And in your answer, maybe you can explain this idea of an extreme weather event and also distinguish between weather and climate, and also maybe between natural climate variability and human-caused climate change. So just give us an overview of this research. Oh, we are...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so, and I suppose you want me to do that in 2 minutes. Is that...
Take 3, please.
Okay, thank you. So, attribution science, very basically, it's trying to understand the reason that something has happened. So if an event occurs, and there are several possible causal factors for that event, then what attribution science is there to do is to be able to tease out what are and what are not the causes of an event, or the causes of some long-term change. So attribution has been fundamental in establishing the link between greenhouse gases and the climate warming that we've seen. In that, what we have shown is that when we run models of the past and present climate, we can only explain the warming that has happened if we include the effect of anthropogenic influences such as greenhouse gases, aerosols, land use change. And if we don't include those factors, then in fact the climate would probably have slightly cooled over the past century. So that's basically what attribution is, and that's why it has been fundamental in climate change research. More recently, attribution has been applied to extreme events. So when an extreme weather event happens, the underlying warming and related changes are probably making a contribution to either the intensity or the frequency of that event happening, and attribution science has been developed in the past decade or so to be able now to make these links to these extreme weather events such as heat waves or extreme rainfall or flooding events. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. And can you just explain for us the difference between weather and climate, for example? So you have these extreme weather events, and somebody might just say, well, that's the result of the weather. How does climate specifically fit into this?
Well, the climate is the statistics of all of the possible weather events that can happen. And so you can think of it in terms of what would be the average for a time of year, how likely it is that a certain hot or cold temperature happens at that time of year. So all of these statistics, that's what makes up climate. And whether a weather event is just the thing that you experience. So that would be something that you would be able to characterize as one particular outcome under a particular climate.
Great, thank you. And so we often hear in the media, I think most recently with certain hurricanes, so Hurricane Harvey, for example, I remember the media covered this extensively. So you often hear in the media that human-caused climate change might be to blame for a certain extreme weather event, right? Some hurricane or some fire or some drought, or made that extreme weather event worse. So how exactly can scientists know this? Can you just give us kind of a bit of background about how scientists are able to attribute these extreme weather events to anthropogenic climate change, either partially or wholly?
So for this sort of work, what we're doing is running the same sort of models that we use to forecast the weather. So when a hurricane happens, you will get modeling centers around the world who will forecast the track and the intensity of that hurricane. And we use the same sorts of models, and what we do is we run those for the event that actually happened, and then we run them with a world that might have happened if we hadn't had the warming. So we can run the same models, but we can take out the warming effect of increased sea surface temperatures. We can take out the implications that has for more humidity in the atmosphere, the implications that has for changing wind patterns, and then we can look at the results of those same forecast models run as if that event happened now, but without climate change having happened. And if you compare the statistics that happen with the weather forecast model of the present day and the weather forecast model of the present day, but without climate change, you can then see that the climate change, the warming, has increased the intensity of that event by a certain amount, or increased the amount of rainfall that has come along with that event. So the actual event that we have experienced has been caused by climate change. If climate change hasn't happened, that event would have been different and often would have been less severe.
Great, thank you. And how reliable is this science? Is there any discussion among scientists about the reliability of the science? Is it reliable for certain kinds of weather events rather than others?
The basic science is very reliable. Again, I'll take the analogy of the weather forecast. Obviously, when you try and predict something, you don't get it exactly right. So there will be a certain amount of error associated with it. So we aren't able to quantify exactly how much climate change has affected these events, but we can say it has affected it by this much plus or minus some sort of error term, and those error terms will be different depending on the type of event. So an event like a hurricane is inherently harder to predict than, say, something like a heat wave. So the accuracy at which we are able to make those statements will be less for hurricanes than it will be for some other sorts of events. But the underlying science is very robust.
Great, thank you. And do you expect the science to get even better in the future as climate models improve? Do you expect that, say, the reliability of some of these attributions will continue to increase?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the same way that we're now able to forecast the weather for 3 days ahead now to the accuracy that we were able to forecast it 1 day ahead 20 years ago, that is a result of all these models getting better, and the same thing will happen with the attribution science and the models that underpin that.
Great, thank you. Emmanuel, I'd like to turn to you to get a legal perspective on this. Can we get Emmanuel up on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so first I'd like, I guess, you to just talk about the prospects for using the legal system to address climate change. So before we get into the specifics about how, legal theorists are using or planning to use attribution science to bolster some of these cases, so what's just sort of the background here? What are the prospects of using the legal system to address climate change? How might the legal system be useful in spurring action to address climate change? What kinds of legal frameworks are in place that might be useful for addressing climate change?
Right. I think the last couple of years have been particularly, we've seen a number of movements that have come out, particularly seeking climate justice for no fault of theirs in a way. And if we take the example of the Peruvian farmer who took a German company to court and is still waiting for his decision, we have cases of that sort happening right now, even in the Netherlands, for example. I think we're continuing to see an increase in these cases, and however, we believe, or we would like to see more how the science itself can play a larger role in sort of being the evidence for such legal cases. And I think that's where there's now a real relationship between the legal framework and the attribution science itself.
Okay, could you elaborate on that a little bit? So what specifically do these cases look like? So are they cases in which a plaintiff is claiming that they've been harmed by some extreme weather event, and they're trying to sue somebody who they are claiming is responsible for this.
Yes.
And then is the idea that the attribution science can make that link, that causal link between the damage and the claim? Is that what's happening?
So if you look at the case from Peru, I mean, basically looking at what was happening to this Peruvian farmer, the risk of losing his home, and sort of then he basically came to Germany, traveled nearly 6,000 miles to sue this German company, RWE, and basically one of the arguments was that it is climate change and carbon emitters who are responsible for this. However, there's really a lack of justification in terms of what the question is: who is responsible and how do you hold people accountable, right? So the question of responsibility, and that really needs to be established. And we believe that there is a role for attribution science in sort of creating that link to legal frameworks.
And what are the prospects of this? I mean, do you, so far it seems like most of these court cases have not been successful, as far as I'm aware. But are you optimistic about the future of some of these cases?
Optimistic, yes. However, yeah, it is a long struggle, like we know, particularly at the end of the day. So I think a lot of these cases are also fighting the battle because we're trying to say that climate change are also matters of justice, climate change are matters of human rights. While there is hope, and I think Richard was right in terms of saying that the attribution science itself can get better, and maybe when the science is starting to get better, we could use it as evidence in courts to be able to take this and say, to establish causality, and that relationship then becomes even more clearer and stronger for us to be able to fight more cases. Yeah. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure my lawyer friends will be able to do this, hopefully.
So is there, and maybe I could open this up for other people as well who might have expertise on this, but is there a difference in the way that climate scientists are thinking about attribution and the way, say, a lawyer or a court might think about attribution?
That's actually a good question, and I think I will turn to our friends here, Richard and Emily, and some of the others. But I think working with some of the lawyer friends, I think basically what the lawyers would want to establish is that relationship, is the causality, because that's what will stand in court.
Okay. So let me open this up to Emily or Richard. Do you want to address this question? So how climate scientists are thinking about attribution versus how, say, a legal scholar or a court might think about attribution?
I think Richard can make a comment on that, on the climate science. Can you get Richard up?
So I think one thing I can say is that we will almost certainly be thinking about it very differently. There are many aspects of legal cases that climate scientists just don't understand, and I mean, whereas we can be very confident that we can establish causality, that is causality between a physical change in the system, i.e. increases in greenhouse gases, and a particular event happening, how that link back from the greenhouse gases to either a company or a government or some sort of aspect of international policy, how that is made, that isn't something that we know about, and that's not something that we could comment about. So exactly how that physical connection that we can establish is going to play out in a court where it's about damages or whether it's about human rights or whatever, that's not something that we really understand, and I can be pretty sure that we don't think about it the same way.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe this is an area where legal scholars and lawyers can begin to collaborate with climate scientists, I think. So there was another, and I'll return to Emmanuel just for this last question, and then I'll move on to Emily. But I am aware of another kind of strategy that some have used in the legal system, which is to try to sue governments for failing to fulfill their duty of care, right? So the basic idea here is rather than suing, say, a company for carbon emissions, they're suing the government for not fulfilling their obligation to their citizens. And I mean, have you heard about these kinds of cases? And do you think that these kinds of cases are very different from like the other case that you gave us? Can we get Emmanuel back on the screen?
I think both cases have, of course, are of very different nature. For example, if you look at the Urgenda climate case that's happening in the Netherlands now, and I think there's a decision supposed to be sometime end of this month. So there, it was basically a group and about 900 citizens who went to court taking the Netherlands government, saying that you could do more with regard to cutting carbon emissions, and this is. It was quite a significant move, and also the way that things have shaped, and then now the cases in the Supreme Court, and I think the judgment is also significant because it's also an access to justice kind of perspective, and for one, if you look at it, it does set precedent in how important it is to take some of these matters more seriously. Because I think that there was also, during this case, there was also a discussion around sort of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, so there is definitely a relationship between these two cases, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Emily, let's turn to you. And so I'd like maybe to begin by having you give us an overview about how climate change and how weather extremes more broadly affect vulnerable people and groups. So who is at most risk of being harmed by climate change, and what kind of dangers do they face? And what kind of factors contribute to this vulnerability?
So we see that those communities that are most exposed to, let's say, in the case of extreme events that we've been talking about now, communities that are already living in contexts of precarious conditions, those conditions, such as people living in low-lying areas, living on coastal areas, living in parts of, let's say, informal settlements or slum areas where they're already exposed to many vulnerabilities, they are then often sort of at the tail end of the exacerbation of climate extremes. So whether it be floods or whether it be drought conditions that affects communities' access to water and so on. So I think it's really important to remember the connection between those who are most vulnerable. They're already living in conditions that are very challenging. So what's the interesting link here then to what Emmanuel is talking about and what Richard are talking about is trying to understand how people are right at the heart of this climate problem, how climate justice is right at the heart of carbon emissions, and that there is science and emerging modern science that can help us to make connections between, let's say, the way we live and emit greenhouse gas emissions and events that then hit people in faraway places that are most vulnerable, that are living in conditions where they're going to be more affected. So these things all link up. There's a sort of joint linkages between all these elements. And I think bringing these things together can help us to really understand the impacts of the everyday activities that we might take here in Sweden and the exposure that communities feel, whether it be in Fiji or whether it be even now, let's say the Harvey storm that hit the US, those communities who are living in the worst parts of the city who are then flooded and have nowhere to move or no insurance or no support system within formal structures to help them change their lives or survive. So I don't know if that
absolutely.
sort of brings it together.
Yeah, and so, so you know, a couple of you have brought up this idea of justice, right? And there are a couple of different ways of thinking about justice. And I think the sense in which attribution science is relevant is thinking about responsibility, right? So what role has, responsibility and liability played in climate negotiations going on right now at the most recent COP, or what's the history of this particular frame of climate justice in international climate policy?
Yeah, so I could say something about the negotiations around what we call loss and damage. There's been a long debate, obviously, about mitigation and how we address our carbon emissions. And then there was after that came a discussion around adaptation, when it was recognized that probably about 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago, that whatever we do to reduce our emissions, we still have to adapt for a certain period of time to the effects of climate change. And now we've got to a point where under the Warsaw International Mechanism article on loss and damage, which was brought up initially by the small island states, asking for recognition and also some form of compensation. So this then really brings us to the heart of the climate justice issue. Who will compensate who and for what? And it's very, very complicated. And it's not been an item that has been handled lightly within the negotiations. There's a lot of contention around it. And in the Paris Agreement, the idea of loss and damage and mitigating the adverse effects of climate change has been included in the Paris Agreement under Article 8. But nevertheless, the idea of liability and compensation was not included. So there are some countries around the world that really don't want to open up this Pandora's box. Manuel, do you want to comment on that? Oh, we can't hear him.
Yes,
great.
Sorry. So it's definitely a very, very tricky thing, and I think there will be a lot of discussions around loss and damage at this COP happening now. For some, I think it's really looking at the political and legal avenue to address this. And it's not just a matter of who pays and the compensation, but also a matter of making someone pay. But in other words, it's looking at legal responsibility about who is responsible for these damages from an institutional perspective. It's about recognizing owners of these damages so that we cannot continue with these sort of similar damages for the future. And I think that's, in a way, really crucial to the discussion on loss and damage, is to be able to, in a way, attribute some of these loss and damages, but also to be looking at the future. So this is not only a discussion of compensation.
So it can provide an incentive for getting countries to act to mitigate their emissions so they're not facing these damages in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, Richard, do you think there's something there?
Richard?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite. I didn't catch the comment that you made there.
Is there something to this idea that compensation, liability to pay compensation for climate damages can help provide an incentive for countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, if you are aware of the negotiations and what has happened with them over the past 30 years, or almost 30 years, as soon as the word gets mentioned, the conversation essentially ceases. It is not a helpful way of looking at things, and it is the idea of taking responsibility, the idea of understanding who is responsible for what, I think is absolutely crucial. We wouldn't have got anywhere if we hadn't made the link between greenhouse gases and the warming and now the extreme events we're seeing. But to focus on compensation has been the main reason why these really, really important issues have continually run into the ground and have not really managed to get anywhere.
Interesting. So we have a point of disagreement, it seems. So I'd like to turn to our three young climate leaders and ask how you and your movement tends to think about these questions of justice. So do you find this idea of responsibility compelling or motivating for your groups and your own motivations for taking on this climate problem? Or do you think about the climate justice problem in a different way, perhaps?
Can I start? Okay. Hi, my name is Jonas. I'm from Regeneration. The first thing I come to think of, and this is an anecdote, so excuse me for that, but I saw a picture in the recent slides by Al Gore. Oh, this is noisy? I don't know what to do about it. He's fixing it. There's a slide with some Pakistani farmers digging big holes in the ground outside the houses. And he asked us, what do you think they're digging for? In the picture, everything is sand, it's barren, it's gone, everything. And I raised my hand and I said, well, they're obviously digging for water, because that's what they need. I said, no, they're digging mass graves for their children because of the drought hitting. So this is the 6th year in a row that they lose their family members to climate disasters. And it's gaining power every single year. And they don't have money to move. There's no country next to them that want to take even more refugees. And they are refugees, they're climate refugees. And there's a somewhat interesting hypocrisy here in the West that we are to help them, but we also knock them in the head if they are polluting too much. And it's difficult to say, well, you shouldn't use the industrial revolution as we have done to get our welfare. You should suffer the consequences of our arrogance, and now you have to live up to your own part of the bargain. So when it comes to climate justice, it's also about acknowledging that it's not about saving the planet, it's about saving their own lives, more often than not. An interesting thing to see is in India, for example, in Nepal and in most parts of the global south, they are, what you say is leapfrogging. They're basically skipping steps in our industrial evolution and technological revolution and inventions. We have pictures of huts made of clay in Congo with solar panels on the roof because it's cheap and affordable and it's delivered and it's way more easy to get a hold on than building a fossil fuel run motor to deliver power to 5 households. We see the biggest source of energy in India right now is solar, or at least the rising market is solar. It's cheaper. It's not because they care, well, they do care, but it's not the biggest interest is to save the planet, to save their own lives. And how can you do that in an affordable way? Luckily, the green energy movement is getting the cheapest bargain right now. So it's awesome here that we can actually deliver on both things. We can help develop the global south, and we can also do it in a responsible green way. And it's more about where's our role in it when it comes to climate justice, because we have the facilitations to help them, and they have the needs and the wants to be facilitated, and also they have the intrinsic wishes to do it properly, like we do. And I think with our movement, Regeneration, it's a Nordic and Baltic Sea area, so it's definitely not the target audience for these industrial revolutions, but we are well aware of our footprint and what we can contribute with, and otherwise we could be inspired by how they are fighting for everyday lives down there. So that's my comment so far. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Perspectives from our other leaders?
I'm Guy, representing Push Sweden in this event. When I was reading over the concept of attribution science, I kind of regretted doing my master's and thought I should have done environmental law instead, because I think there's so much potential lying in this concept. And not to manipulate it and use it only for the purposes of climate justice or trying to further the climate justice agenda. But I too share the optimism shared by the ministers in the previous event, and they gave a myriad of examples of where the Nordic countries are heading in the right direction. But the Nordic countries are pretty small, and they are limited in the impact that they can have. They can certainly demonstrate leadership on climate change and come up with different innovations, etc. But there are some very large polluters out there and some very large vested interests, which are going to be much harder to budge than very progressive thinking, like situations that we have here today. And for that, I think that's going to take legal precedence. And so if attribution science can be utilized in a way, and again, I'll reiterate, not to be manipulated, but if you can directly attribute, especially like slow onset of different climate change effects, to not necessarily looking for reparations or compensation for past events, but certainly looking forward to companies and countries which are looking to further extract. If you can pass some kind of law, potentially on international level, of course, that's very hard to do, but it can set the precedent and it can be used in future legal cases. Especially when we look at like 12 of the largest 20 fossil fuel companies in the world are currently state-owned, with Saudi Aramco and Gazprom being first and third, respectively, or maybe disrespectfully. And so they're state-owned, and I mean, I've been to these COP negotiations like we have in Madrid right now, and we see representatives of these countries floundering and filibustering to a professional degree. They are absolute masters of it, and it's horrible to watch. And it took all my willpower not to flip the tables just as an observer there. But these people they will delay and they will further inaction and use strategic inertia until they are forced to do otherwise. And I think you can use a legal framework to do that. So I think attribution science has huge potential if managed in the correct way.
Great, thank you. Sophia, in your organization, do you think about these questions of responsibility? Is this important for motivating you or for your companions?
I just want to start off with saying Fires of Future isn't an organization, but we are a movement.
A movement, I
grassroots
apologize.
movement.
Yes.
Our movement is mostly about putting pressure on our politicians and that they need to act. And I think attribution science is very important, as showing that these extreme events happening everywhere is connected to climate change is a very easy way of saying, look, this is happening because of climate change. This is happening now. We need to do something. This is not fair on everyone else. It's not fair on everyone having to, be in these conditions when, we are obviously pretty much fine up north here, but we are still being a part of all these emissions. We need to be doing something more than we are. Even if we might be doing more than other countries, it doesn't mean we're doing enough. I mean, just looking at all the Nordic countries, you can see that lots of steps being taken in the wrong direction. I mean, just yesterday I heard about the fact that Norway is going to be dumping 30 million tons of waste in a fjord. I mean, we need to be doing more than we are, even if we are doing more than other countries. It's just not fair on everyone else that's not actually doing anything. And I think attribution science and law education showing that maybe these events are sparked by climate change, that it can help these other countries, and other countries that have it better off maybe can be able to help and do more.
Good. So thanks. So one of the points you made is that these extreme weather events, and specifically maybe the link between these extreme weather events and climate change, can help increase the salience of the problem for people, right? And Emily, I'd like you to talk about this. I mean, do you think that this is true? Do you think it's true that that the public's experience of these extreme weather events, either their own experiences, I know a lot of people in Europe last year probably experienced part of this heat wave that I was watching on the news. I wasn't around. I don't think it made it this far north, though, but these incredible temperatures in France and Germany, or their experience of seeing these extreme weather events in the media. Do you think that helps draw attention to climate change, and do you think it might actually help spark action to address climate change among the public?
I think that's a great question, and I think that these are the kinds of questions that we need to be studying and understanding better. There have been some work done in the US, in Colorado, I think, looking at whether social movements are triggered by extreme events and to what extent action comes out of that. And their study showed that if there was a connection to the science and a connection to attribution, it was suggested more likely that those actions would be implemented and longer term. But in many cases, perhaps not. And I think that we have a real opportunity here, both sort of understanding how movements are emerging, to what extent the science is really informing, and what extent the kind of science we're talking about, this modern attribution science, if it's socialized in the right way, how it then can inform and inform action amongst social movements, not only in the global north, but also in the global south. I just wanted to make a point there, linking back to the previous session, is that we're often thinking about social movements suddenly emerging. So our dear Greta has done an enormous, fantastic job. And many of you here are engaging and involved in movement now. We also have movements in the global south where people have been engaging in movements around things like water, access to food, access to sanitation, access to basic needs, and have been doing so for many, many, many years. And I wonder now if we'll start to see a combination of those kinds of social movements with climate change as well, and maybe there also a greater understanding of the connections between things will help to connect people in local places, but also more internationally.
Great, thank you. And Richard, so what do you think scientists can do to, say, better communicate some of this research to the public?
I think the most important thing is to be very clear and to be to speak about those things that we have a lot of confidence in, and to make sure that the statements we're making are linked to those sorts of events and those sorts of things that are really affecting people. The other area that I think is really important is to look in a great deal of depth into events that have happened, not just thinking about the obvious links with climate change in terms of the specific weather event or the specific climate event that's happened, but then also to get involved in many of the consequences of that, because often when you start to analyze the impacts that have occurred as a result of a flood or a drought or something like that, or a wildfire, there are many aspects of natural and human systems which are impacted, and some of those have links back to the physical sciences. And I think that we need to put more effort into focusing on those and being very, very clear that we can make these links from the climate event to other events in other physical systems, and then the impacts those have on people and communities and ecosystems, etc.
Great. And Emmanuel. Can we get him back on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I think you have to speak, and then we can get you back.
All right. Okay.
We attributed the cause of the lack of seeing you on the screen to the lack of your voice, so it's a success.
Right.
Scientific success. So same question. What do you think researchers, so somebody in your position, scholars, can do to better disseminate their research and their thinking about these questions to the broader public or to social movements?
Sure. I just wanted to sort of start off by saying that last time when you said there was a disagreement, I don't think it was a disagreement. It was more, I think we were complimenting each other in a way, because I think I said that it's not a matter of compensation, but rather that the discourse should actually act as a precedent for the future. Having said that, and I do think I am a researcher, a social scientist, and I do believe that as researchers we do have responsibility, and that I think we need really a new conceptual understanding of how some of these different sciences can actually come together, work together. Particularly now, for example, this interesting work on attribution, how does that relate to sort of legal frameworks and what Emily was talking about, social movements, and how does all of this come together? I was very glad to hear, I was listening in to the previous panel before us who said that there was a lot of mention of science today in Madrid. And I'm very glad to hear that. And I think that's number one. Number two, and I do think that also is there are many, many Gretas in the global south. And I think we need more sort of forces coming together to listen to them. We need more work on sort of cutting across various disciplines so that scientists can actually be in really a close relationship with policymakers, sit on some of those tables to be able to discuss these issues more openly.
Great, thank you. And I apologize for misunderstanding you earlier. So I'd like to turn back to our climate movement leaders and maybe get you to reflect a little bit about what you need from scientific research, what you think that scientists can do better to communicate with you and what you can do better maybe to communicate back to science. So, reflect on how you use scientific research in your own movements.
I can start on that one. Right now, I think scientists have a way of actually just using like a very scientific language when they present facts, which makes it really hard for the general public to understand a lot of what they mean, especially youths, and especially when it's a language you don't speak as your first language. And I think what scientists could work on is how they present their science, not only for other scientists, but also science for people that aren't scientists, that just want to know what's happening and want to know the basic information about the science. They could write a summary or text or something that would be much easier to understand by other people, and that they could much more easily spread to others so that more people can understand and raise awareness in that way as well. As in Fridays for Future, we use a lot that we listen to the science, that the politicians have to listen to the science, and it would make it easier if it's easier to understand the science. Because reading an IPCC report is hard, because it's not the easiest language to read. And I think something like that would be of big benefit.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so we often hear the mantra of like unite behind the science, but like science isn't just like a concept out there alone in space. Like there are people producing this, there are scientists, and these people have a responsibility in the work that they do and how they communicate it, exactly as you say. And I think this very much ties into producing honest science in a sense. So to stand behind your research and not simply produce results or models or pathways that seem politically feasible or socially acceptable, especially when it comes to the creation of integrated assessment models and mitigation roadmaps, etc. Because what the public will read and what politicians will read at the end of the day has been through a long, drawn-out process before it reaches that point. And there's a lot of different bits of information and data that goes into that throughout that process. And a lot of that can get lost in kind of a black box nature because it comes from so many different angles. And so, yeah, I think my point is that the scientists shouldn't err on the side of what's politically feasible and what's socially acceptable, but what is going to happen in scientific terms, what will happen with the atmosphere. Like, I've never heard of any form of science which errs on the side of optimism more than climate science. It's the complete opposite. The precautionary principle is implemented in every other form of science, is seemingly less so in this. And I think that needs to go in reverse for this to be handled responsibly.
Well, the only thing I really do is to back my co-speakers up. They are speaking the truth. Apart from that, as far as I recall, the IPCC is not a bunch of scientists, but they are a mouthpiece for the scientists and deliver the news in beautiful reports that might be boring and terrible to read, but nonetheless are very important, as you say yourself. To me, it's also a language barrier, because in English you say science a lot. At least in American English, you say science a lot, as it being some kind of entity on its own that breathes and lives outside of the cosmic sphere and mental understanding of human capacity, which is not. It's science is what we do, it's what we breathe, it's what we think, it's what we deem possible and not possible. And we do it both through social sciences, we do it through metaphysics, we do it through astronomy, through to natural sciences. I guess climate policies are mostly based on natural sciences and not social sciences, even though they also have a place to part to play. So for me, it's also about talking about what are we actually talking about. We talk about natural sciences, social sciences. Who are to blame if anybody? Who are the source? What is the methods? Are we using imperialistic data? Are we using observations? Are we using normative data, descriptive data, and whatsoever? It's not making it easier to understand me using all these words. It's much easier to use science, but it's not as simple as that. So it's also about using the rhetorics properly, because even now, as you say, it's difficult to understand the use the reports. It's also obviously hard to understand for certain precedents what the scientists are telling us. So it's not just making it easy to understand; it's also making the specifying really, really carefully what we're talking about and how we can make use of it, because it is useful, the sciences, no matter what department they belong to. And it's also just about really, really making it clear what we are talking about. And I think that's an issue that scientists are not alone of having. It's all about the politicians and us, the everyday normal people who are making use of it. But to be careful what we are taking in. But because if we are careful, like the scientists are, and I'm using the phrase scientists freely as I just criticized, then we can actually talk about what we want to talk about, because we can be clear. Clarity is paramount in science and policy making as well, or it should be. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Emily, I'll turn it to you. Do you think that there's a possibility that attribution science can be misused in a way?
Yes, I suppose it could be. There are ways in which it could be turned around and used in the wrong hands. Sure. I mean, it's also contested currently. Not everybody likes attribution. There might be those who feel like it's impossible to create this causality or prove the kinds of things that we're talking about here. It could be undermined, all sorts of things. I think that it's worthwhile giving it a shot, looking at what the science can offer. I think it's worthwhile understanding better how that science links to other aspects, as raised by you guys. Also using it as a way to communicate, perhaps. Communicate responsibility, communicate vulnerability, communicate loss and damage, and the losses and damages that we see happening. There's a recent paper that just came out in Nature. I don't know if any of you have read it, by Tim Lenton and colleagues. It's well worth reading, which talks about tipping points, and that we've sort of gone beyond some of the tipping points that were predicted in the last 5 years or so. Things are moving much, much faster. So I think, therefore, the losses and damages that we will see will be falling out much quicker, perhaps. So we need all the kind of engagement in different kinds of science, including attribution, at this point in time.
Excellent, thank you. And I think at this time we should open up the discussion to our audience. So we have about 10 minutes to field questions. So do we have a microphone that we can pass around? So I saw a hand. Could you put your hands up and here, and then I think it'll be helpful for everybody.
So I was wondering if anyone was following kind of the developments around attribution science, and I know we were talking about how placing, past debt and burden kind of slows down the conversation and progress that might be made around that. But I know in remote sensing we have a lot of breakthroughs coming around methane emissions. Currently it's still not really at the point we need to be to say for certain, like, this is a point source of carbon pollution or methane. But in the future, you think there could be legal justification for saying, okay, these are the people who are polluting or are not abiding by the necessary, legislation for carbon plants and where coal plants and whatnot, to really kind of point fingers and blame institutions that are causing majority of climate change.
Great. Emmanuel, would you like to address this question?
I'm not sure I actually understood the question. So,
so I guess with remote sensing and
yes,
I can. I'm happy to have a go if you like.
Sure.
Because I think I understood what the questioner was talking about, and it is certainly it is correct that Earth observations of greenhouse gas atmospheric concentrations and how those evolving has advanced very significantly, and it is now at the point that building inventories of greenhouse gases from Earth observations, i.e. from top-down observational assessments, is now being done alongside the bottom-up inventory assessments, and that is being looked at as a way, I think, as you were saying, of being able to to be able to assess how well the bottom-up inventories, and essentially to check whether people, well, whether they are doing what they say they're doing, which I think is what you're asking for, but also the other thing is to be able to see whether there are other other emissions that are happening. And methane is potentially coming out of all sorts of natural systems as a result of the warming, to be able to capture that as well. That isn't really an attribution question. That's actually just a straight observational question. But these observations are at the heart of everything that we do, and that's a very important area for sure.
Great, thank you. And you had a question?
Yeah, my question kind of goes to Richard again a little bit. How much, on like a public level, how much cooperation or interest have you seen from the media in terms of like utilizing attribution science to, how should we say, like attribute certain weather events in the news and make it aware on a public level that attribution science has proven that this is a causational event, caused by human, basically.
Well, it's often the first question that people ask, and it's the interest has become very significant, and it's important in several ways. One is that it's not always the case that an extreme event that happens is linked to climate change. It can be just another extreme event like the ones we've always seen, but it has more of an impact because there are other factors, other human factors that are involved. But in terms of how important this is becoming, this is now is being looked at almost as an operational activity. So the European Commission is now looking at building a prototype operational attribution service, so that it has everything, all the technology there. So when an event happens, it can almost within a week or so be able to actually pull apart what are the causes of that, because the media interest is so high. And when you get in the developing countries these movements that come around the extreme events, that it's really important from that perspective, because it then if the media picks that up, if the Western media picks that up, and then we can make attribution statements around that, then that adds extra weight to the concerns that these people are raising. And one hopes that would then mean that they would get a better hearing as a result of it.
Thank you. Good to hear.
Thanks. We have time for additional questions. In the back.
Hi, my name is Mariam, and I'm from Extinction Rebellion. And I wonder, like, if there isn't a dangerous misconception that's been in this discussion and the previous discussion is that the Nordic countries are taking the lead, but we're not really recognizing that we're using, like in Sweden, we're using 4.2 planets instead of 1. And India is like using half of a planet. And when we say we're taking the lead, considering like all the welfare systems we have and finances, and even Isabella said in the previous discussion that we have all the technology to make a great transition, but we're not taking it. And we're not reaching the climate goals that we set up in Paris. We have increased our emissions since last year. How can we say that we're taking the lead when actually like poor countries like Gambia and Morocco will fulfill their Paris agreements and not us? Aren't we just like making our populations, our citizens in the Scandinavian countries leaning back with a misconception that everything is going well and that we will reach those targets?
So let's have our movement leaders address this. So from your perspective, are we doing okay?
No.
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 I can agree with that.
No, so the thing is, this is interesting because for some reason there's this a narrative in public discourse and for the politicians that it must be a win-win situation. We must reduce our footprint, but we will also continue our growth, and we must prosper even more than we've done so before. As if that's possible with the goals we've set as far. In Denmark, we set an ambitious goal of 70% reduction in carbon emission by 2030. I can spoil it right now, that's not going to happen. Because the Danes are too conform. Like, well, sure, that's a good plan, I can sign that. I can show it to a Facebook feed that, hey, everybody in the family, I also care about the climate. Then go down and buy a new pair of shoes made in Taiwan, right? So the thing is, this is what we need the politicians to be able to answer on their own, but it needs to be understood by the public and by the politicians that it has to be a loss-win situation in some form. I'm not saying 50-50, but we can't continue the well-off being we are having right now and continue the growth, as the gentleman in the earlier panel he mentioned from the audience, and also reach the requirements, and also be the leaders, and also be visionaries within 10 years. It's not doable. So what do we do then? Well, what do we choose? Do we choose the narrative? Do we choose to be the climate region of the world in a false pretendhood, and then start knocking on the heads of the Chinese and the Americans that they should all take our responsibilities same? Well, we can't really. We have to sweep in front of our own front doors before we nag the others. So I'm not answering the question, I'm echoing it. But I'm also saying it's so important, and we have to hold our politicians responsible, but we also have to be willing ourselves to vote for the politicians that are brave and to say, well, we're going to have to stop driving. I have to stop or cut half of the buses. Public sector have to multiply tenfold the tickets of airplanes, and we can't no longer import meat from animals we have in our own country that we can slaughter and eat if we have to eat meat, right? Which apparently we do. So this is the thing, and going on a knock on the politician's door and say, I'm ready to take that step. I'm ready to lower my well-being. I'm still good off. I mean, we're not, southern Syria, but I'm ready to take that step in order to actually do my bit and not use 4.2 globes a year.
Emily, you had a comment on
I
that?
just want to say thank you for your comment, and also hopefully the message we're giving here is not that some kind of silver bullet through attribution and legal cases would solve or be the solution. I mean, there are massive changes that have to take place in the world across many, many levels. I think amongst the scientific community, universities are now trying to engage with the idea of a climate emergency and trying to actually come up with real tangible ways in which universities as myndighet are actually reducing their carbon emissions. So that's a real challenge that universities cannot shy away from, and scientific communities, scientific flying, it's something we talk about every day now. Can we fly to the conference? How do we deal with this? So these are things that are part of our everyday workings as well now. I think what we're doing with this research is to explore a dimension of trying to maybe unlock some of those transformations through a particular avenue where we also see that there hasn't been significant political will in terms of really moving. We're not just talking about states here, we're talking about big corporations who are, and the fossil fuel industry that are very powerful actors in society. So how can we help to unlock some potential for change? How can we understand how societies are changing in themselves, what they want, the agency that exists there amongst social movements like your social movements, like the movements you're in, to better understand that, to also link that better to the science and a better understanding of, in the long term, can we really push all of this to some kind of bigger changes so it doesn't just flop off and we continue business as usual. So I hope that we get that message across, and maybe we need to be a little bit more clear with our communication around that.
Great, and let's thank our panelists.
Okay.